This is the Almost Awakened Podcast, a no-nonsense approach to spirituality with your hosts, Brittany Hartley and Bill Reel. Here we dive deep into the wisdom traditions while acknowledging insightful breakthroughs in science, psychology, and human development. Our goal is to explore the good life and the very best of spirituality. No nonsense required. Check us out at almostawakened.org, where you can check out past episodes, make a donation, email us a question or comment, or find out more about the resources we shared. And now, today's podcast episode.
All right. Brittany Hartley, how are you?
I'm so good. Welcome, everybody, to a new episode of the Almost Awakened podcast. I'm Britt Hartley with my co-host, Bill Reel, and we're going to skip our lovely banter that we usually do at the beginning and move right into introducing our guest today, because we really want to utilize all the time that we have with him. So I have with us today Thomas Jay Oord, and he's a good friend of mine and one of my spiritual mentors. He lives here in Boise. And I love our conversations and I love the work that he's doing. And so I just wanted to pick his brain here on this podcast and introduce him to you all. So Tom, why don't you just kind of tell us, your usual thing about what you're up to?
Well, thanks for the opportunity for the chat and for the kind words, Brittany. What's the usual for me? I try to help people think about big questions. And often the answers that I'm attracted to involve beginning with the idea that there actually is a God who is loving. But I often find that by the time the conversation ends, the God of love that I'm proposing sounds a little different than the one many people have been exposed to.
And then tell us a little bit. I would love to start with because I think you have some similarities to the people in this audience. So kind of go back a little bit to being raised in kind of more of a fundamentalist kind of God. And then kind of, I would love to hear, your stint in atheism, and then kind of what intuitions brought you to where you are now.
Yeah, sounds great. Yeah, I was raised in a fairly evangelical kind of community. Church of the Nazarene is the denomination. And I took religion, faith, God, Jesus, whatever. I took all that stuff really seriously, and eventually kind of became a little evangelist of sorts. Not just of sorts, I really was an evangelist. But then I started reading some really smart people who were not only not a part of my tradition, but some of them were atheists, agnostics. And this was near the end of my college career. And for the sake of intellectual honesty, I had to admit that I didn't have really good reasons to believe there was a God. And so for a period I don't know if I was an atheist or agnostic, but I just didn't think there was a God, at least the God that I had been raised with. And I started piecing things back together, or coming back to a belief in God, based on a deep search for meaning and my intuitions that in some sense love was at the heart of who I ought to be, and maybe even the heart of reality. And that meant actually returning to have a fairly kind of traditional role as a youth pastor, associate pastor in various churches, becoming an ordained elder in the Church of the Nazarene. I'm still that. But it meant that I was willing to forego or set aside some of the common views of God that people have. For instance, I don't think God is in control or even could be in control. I don't think God knows the future. So just to give you a little taster of some of those ideas.
Yeah, and then if you don't mind, I don't know how much of this you talk about openly, but a while ago you made a pretty big stir in Boise because the ideas of this kind of God that you were postulating, that maybe isn't in control of everything, maybe doesn't see the future, and kind of allow trauma to happen in the world. It started to kind of come up against this traditional God to the point where your career at NNU, a university was really threatened. So can you talk about kind of the tension during that time of those two gods really kind of coming head to head, and what that's like? Because I think it's a tension that we can all feel in the broader world too, but you really had it in your life pretty profoundly.
Yeah, I think that the views of God I currently have are fit comfortably in the general theological tradition that I'm a part of, but they are uncommon. They put more conservative people on edge. And so some of those people were worried that I was a professor teaching not only students at the university, but potential leaders and pastors. And so some of the more influential ones joined forces with the president, and I was laid off for technical reasons related to student growth, when everyone knows that the real reason was the theological things.
Mm.
Um, so
Corrupting
yeah,
the youth. It's almost,
it's
it's like corrupting the youth for Socrates. It's almost like a
that's
badge.
right.
It's like a badge of honor. So I guess
Yeah.
really the next question to move into is, let's dive into what you're talking about here. So what is open and relational theology?
Open and relational theology is a kind of umbrella set of claims that includes under it a whole bunch of different views, people, movements, etc. But the idea that unites them, or the two ideas that unite them, are that God is a relational God. God is engaged in our lives, affected by what we do, not just giving to us, but actually receiving from us. And the idea that God moves through time with us into an open future rather than being outside of time and seeing all things in one glance. God is actually learning like we learn, because new things occur moment by moment. And that has the advantage of fitting more nicely with our notions about free will. It fits better the notion that God is affected, the relational part. And so those are the two big ideas. A lot of people under that umbrella also want to rethink God's power, such that God is not omnipotent. They want to rethink how we think about God creating, the primacy of love, and a bunch of other important issues. But the open and relational is what unites this diversity.
All right, I'm going to ask one or two more questions, and then Bill, I know, has some questions, and you and I push on you all the time,
Yeah.
Tom, because it's just so helpful to push against someone who will hold space and really consider my question, and you've thought about it, and
Hmm.
um, even if we end up at the end of the conversation disagreeing, it's just been so helpful to have
Hmm.
you to kind of wrestle these things. But I want to do a couple more questions before we move into some of that space. So it's been interesting watching you and your career and your books. How many books now, Tom? I've lost count.
So have I.
How many books?
Somebody asked me this recently. I think it's about 30. It's somewhere in that neighborhood. Um,
I've been following along, and I've been watching people's response to this idea of a different kind of God that, isn't the Old Testament God, and just is a little bit more close to our intuitions about love and relationality. And the most interesting for me, and I want to hear your intuitions about this, but the most interesting kind of subgroup for me, that I've seen kind of react to open and relational theology are those who have experienced trauma. And there's this population that has intuitions about God, or spiritual experiences that they call God, however that is, but something happened in their life that shouldn't have happened, or it wasn't good, or something happened in the church with a bishop, or something happened, and it just kind of rattles this notion of God, and then they come across you, and there's something that happens with this population that's just really fascinating. So can you talk to me about kind of what you're seeing as you're putting out open and relational theology with this kind of trauma group?
Yeah, that's a great observation. I get letters weekly from people who have read a book that I wrote called God Can't: How to Believe in God and Love After Tragedy, Abuse, and Other Evils. And what makes this book particularly helpful is that I just straight up say God simply can't single-handedly stop or prevent the kind of crap that we go through in the world. A lot of other people have wanted to appeal to free will, but then they'll say, well, God allows evil because God cares about your free will, or God permits your sexual abuse because God's got a better plan, or even worse, God's punishing you. And I simply go to what I think is the key issue, and that is a truly loving God who could prevent evil but allows it is not really a loving God. And it makes more sense, I think, to believe that God loves everyone all the time, doesn't want evil, and simply can't single handedly prevent evil. And that's the kind of idea that provokes the kind of letters, almost all of them positive, saying, thank you. Thank you. Now I no longer have to think God had abandoned me or was punishing me or was trying to teach me a lesson when, my mother died in a wreck or whatever.
Hmm. And then, oh,
Go ahead. Oh, sure. If you want, I can throw something else. So,
yeah.
first off, thanks for coming on. And I've spent, several hours in the last week kind of listening to podcasts where you were interviewed. And I really deeply appreciate the perspective you come from, because in Mormonism, which we came from, right, in these high demand fundamentalist religions that are out there, and there's a bunch of them, there's this, and it happens in Christianity in general too, to some degree, but there are always voices in the room who claim to know exactly what God thinks and to line out the path. And it seems as though anytime a voice gets into the specifics, they seem to be off base,
Hmm.
right? So the safe way seems to be to back off and really approach God from just the edges.
Hmm.
And anytime you really get into the center of it, you probably have overstepped your bounds and you've chosen to define God in ways that don't really work. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are, because it's really hard to, I love your view. It's really hard to walk back to that and let go of all the voices that are in anybody's, their outer authorities from their tribe, to let
Hmm.
go of those completely and to realize that you really almost can't name it. You almost can't define it. And it's going to be really hard, I think, to get the human population to sit in that, seeing as most folks tend to stay at lower stages of development, see the world in dualistic binary ways. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are in moving people from dogmatism and rigidity to a much softer way, and how difficult maybe that transition is for folks.
Yeah, I kind of see things as often following a three-step process. Um, the first step is kind of the picture of God you've been given by your tribe, your parents, maybe just the particular subculture you're in. And in those kinds of traditions or in those kinds of scenarios, people tend to say, okay, this is God. This is what God is like. This God does X, Y, Z. And oftentimes a whole lot more than just X, Y, Z. But you're at least given the impression that we're really confident this is the correct picture of God. But almost always that ends up having some holes and people have questions. And people who are brave enough, or people who go through tragedies and feel compelled to leave that kind of approach, will often move into, I'll call it a mystery realm. And that is, they'll say, look, we don't know what God is like. Who can be sure about that? But there's some transcendence. I have some intuitions there's more than what this reality is. But in the mystery kind of stage, people are really reticent to put any kind of descriptors on the divine. And most progressive circles I'm in, people are like that. I was speaking in Vancouver this summer, and I did a big lecture at a downtown progressive church, and all they wanted to talk about was whether or not the word God made any sense, because I had used that word fairly regularly, and they all had negative baggage attached to it, and they rightfully wanted to find something else, to use. The third step, I think, acknowledges that we just can't know for sure if there is a God and what kind of God might exist, what kind of God is if God exists. So, in the third step, you're humble. You don't claim to have it all figured out. I like to say you're not even certain there is a God, and if there is, you're not certain what that God is like. But you're willing to put forward a proposal that has some details to it on the table. You could be wrong about it, but that proposal you put on the table because you think it fits the way life works, or it matches some experiences you've had, or it fits with general revelation of cross traditions or science or whatever. You kind of put this out there and you say, okay, I'm not sure this is who God is, what God is like. I'm not even sure there is a God, but if there's a God, I think this view or model of God makes the most sense for these kinds of reasons. And that's the kind of endeavor I'm proposing when I say things like God can't prevent evil single handedly. I don't know that for sure. But if there is a God, I think this kind of model makes better sense than any alternative I know of.
So I want to follow that up with the idea that human beings have been on the planet, I don't know, 200,000 years, whatever it is. And along that way, there have been 1,000, if not more, myth stories about what that awe and wonder is about something bigger than us being. And I'm just curious if in your own path, if you would say Christianity best encapsulates that, or in your mind you go, look, I don't know if it's Christianity, I don't know if it's Buddhism, I don't know if it's like, how do you approach other religions and the 10,000 myth stories that you don't even know about because we weren't on the planet at the time that those came into being and extinguished, right? And
Yeah.
so do you see Christianity as the best way to frame that, and kind of what is your reason or thoughts behind that question?
I myself am attracted to being a follower of Jesus and consider myself a Christian. I find it most attractive overall. However, open relational thought isn't limited to Christians. In fact, next month I'm hosting a scholarly conference in which Muslim and Christian open and relational scholars are going to be talking about the shared vision of God they have. And then there's obviously some differences between Islam and Christianity, but there are Baha'i open and relational people. There are Jewish. There are, people who don't identify with any religious tradition, but who like this open and relational vision of God and self-identify as such. So I also think God is present and active in all places and all times, trying to communicate with all people, and therefore, there's a variety of religious traditions that have something valuable to offer. But just because God is present and active and all traditions have something to offer, it doesn't necessarily mean all traditions are exactly the same in value or have the same amount of truth or have the same or equally adequate picture of God. And so that's where that third move that I was talking about, where I'm willing to say, this myth, to use your language, or this model, this makes better sense, I think, of all the data I'm aware of and my deep intuitions.
Okay, I'm going to do one pushback here. This is
Good.
actually a conversation we've had before.
Yeah.
But I want to follow up here because I want everyone to see this argument too. So I've asked you before, we've had this conversation before, and I'm still curious as to why Christianity still speaks to you in that way. Because for me, my intuition is that if I believed in an open and relational God, if I believed that God was relationality and love, then the biggest kind of barrier to that is just kind of our neurotic brains and our illusions of separateness, right? And it seems like to me the best religion or at least spiritual practice to kind of break that illusion, break the kind of neuroticism, break that illusion of separateness so that we can really just dip into, you seem to be a human just like me, and I am you, and you are me, and I love you, to get to that space. I feel like Buddhism does that the best. I feel like Buddhism is the one that kind of dispels that separation to allow love to flow freely between conscious creatures. And so that makes the most sense to me, if I really believed in an open and relational God. So what is it about Christianity that still calls to you kind of more than other traditions?
Yeah. Well, there are a variety of Buddhisms, but let's talk Pure Land Buddhism, for instance, or I'll just say the non-theistic Buddhisms. I'm really attracted to arguments for a particular kind of God. And so religious traditions that don't have a God are less attractive to me. I think God plays an important role in creating the universe, in drawing us toward light and love, et cetera, et cetera. So, um, but that's kind of more theism, more generally. What about Christianity? You're asking me, am I attracted to? Um, Christians have done some crappy things, and the Christian scriptures sometimes portray God in unloving ways. So I definitely don't want to come across as saying the Christian tradition's got everything right. But Christianity has this claim that we not only ought to love strangers, which Judaism has, but we ought to love enemies. And that's not a widely embraced notion across traditions. I'm not saying no one else has it, but that is like a pretty amazing thing. That's a part of the Christian tradition I like a lot. Um, Christianity, for all its flaws, has some claims in its sacred text that push the primacy of love and the identification of God and love better than most other traditions I'm aware of. So again, I'm not saying Christianity's got it all figured out, whatever, but that matters to me.
Hmm.
And I suspect there's also, just maybe throw one other thing, I suspect there's also the fact that while for a while I walked away from the Christian tradition, my growing up in it and my friendships of people in that tradition, that probably also plays a role. It's kind of like, okay, I know it's not wise for me to try to do this without any community. So if I'm going to have a community, might as well try to find a good one within this tradition that I kind of
Hmm.
already know.
Yeah, that last piece, I've said to you before, I have some holy envy of,
Yeah.
because there is, not that we don't talk about Mormonism a lot on this podcast, but you and I have talked about how there is pieces of early Mormonism, especially, that was very open and relational, that God
Yeah.
is in relationship with humanity and in process with us, and that the future is open. It's a much more kind of human God, and not an other kind of God. Um, and so there was a lot of room to play there, and it's not that way anymore. Those strands of Mormonism are almost dead now for all intents and purposes, which is really sad to me. But if there was, places that were kind of bringing that God alive, or there was a place to play there under the umbrella of Mormonism, I really envy that, because it's something that, through all kinds of Mormon history, we kind of got away from, and ended up. It's interesting that that some strands of Christianity became more like early Mormonism with this open and relational process God, but Mormonism ended up going more like fundamental Christianity in the end. And so there was just kind of this kind of switcheroo that happened. So you talked about sacred text. So how do you then read the Bible, and how do you kind of encourage others to read the Bible?
Yeah. I think the Christian Bible points to a God of perfect love in general. There's tons of passages that point against it, but if I were to take the big picture, I also think this Jesus guy gives a very strong revelation or claim that this God is loving. So I'm trying to follow him in the way I live my life, at least the general kinds of contours of what it means to live a life of love. But I like to very openly acknowledge to people that there are some portions of scripture that suck, that just get God wrong, that I think are bad, just to be blunt. I make that claim based upon other passages of scripture. So it's, I'm not coming to the Bible with my like um, with presuppositions that haven't already been influenced by the Bible. What I'm doing is I'm emphasizing or claiming that some ideas are truer, are more accurate, etc. And so my advice to people when they read scriptures is to look for those big themes, and they may in fact agree with me that love is the big theme, and we can use that to criticize those passages that seem to undermine love.
And are you a fan of I see like two responses. There's some people who say like, let's take out the verses of like God sending bears to kill children. Like they're just too damaging. Let's just take them out. And then there's also the group that kind of says, you know what, let's leave those in there because we learn a lot about what humans do and our shadow side, and there's lessons to learn even in those passages. Are you more of a fan of just like, let's just not read these in church anymore. Let's not have children read that story. Or do you kind of want it all in there, but really just teach people how to be able to separate those and learn from both?
Yeah, I don't think I am in the opinion to cut out passages, but I do think it's foolish to have children read some passages, and there are some passages that I probably wouldn't read in church. Um, so it's a difficult issue, because if I'm so intent on not teaching those passages, then in effect I'm cutting them out, right? But on the other hand, there's something to be gained, and sometimes I've noticed over the years that there's a passage I think is really crap, but then I'll get a different angle on it, a different interpretation, and I'll say, oh, well, maybe there's actually something there that I missed earlier. So, in lieu of in case the possibility might come along that I could reinterpret some passages I currently think are crap, I guess I'm willing to keep them in the text.
So I think what I'd love to do now is just do some kind of fast fire questions that are going to be more pushback kind of questions. And I don't do this because this is a battle that I'm going to win and I'm going to flex my whatever. This is because it's so helpful. I'm so saddened by like so much of the debates online between, atheists and believers. It's this weird battle where the believer may have like they're trying to defend some kind of Old Testament thing, and it's just so easy for the atheist to just like blow them up. And the very, very interesting thing about you is that, if I were to bring up evolution, like you've thought about this, like you've read about this, you've thought about these issues deeply, and it's just a better conversation than a lot of the ones that are online. And I just want people to get a sense of that. And so as I'm pushing back, just everyone know this is just out of a deep love for Tom,
Uh,
and he can handle it, and he's thought
that's
about
right.
all these things, and it's going to be okay. And
Sounds
so
good, Brett.
Bill and I are just going to take turns, just kind of, with our skeptical backgrounds. Part of coming out of like you said, the stage 2 of kind of coming out of a certain view of God is you have a certain allergy to truth claims.
Hmm.
And then, like you say, as you move into stage 3, you're just trying to open your mind to what is and people's ideas and how do we make sense of this. And so I want to kind of move into that space where we're just trying these ideas and hopefully getting out of this place that you usually see with debates online, which is just everybody's triggered about everything and it just
Yeah,
doesn't go anywhere. So Bill and I are just going to take turns with just some pushback questions. So
great.
one of my big questions for you, Tom, and I think one of the reasons that really, as I was studying with you, I couldn't fully go to where you are, even though there was just a big part of my heart that wanted to, is that what does it say about God that there's such a limit to life in the universe? And not only is there, we only know of life on one planet. If this was good, if this was God, if this was God, what God wanted to bring us to this place where we could be in relationship with one another and have lovely conversations like these, if this
Hmm.
was the point of it, and it's not happening as we know of anywhere else in the universe, and then the past 200,000 years for humanity, I mean, people are dying at age 30 from their teeth. It's suffering. They don't know about germs. It's superstitious. It's these just afraid tribes that are just clinging onto existence. And then 99% of all species have gone extinct. And so it just seems to me like if this was God's project, um, it's been a tough ride to get here. And
Yep.
it begs the question of is this God idea the best idea that we have, considering we have such a violent, suffered history and such a limit to life, and most life on the planet is already extinct anyway. It seems like if there is a God, he's fighting a losing battle.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
Okay, I'm going to try to make things succinct so we can do this fairly rapidly. It sounds like what you're proposing is a variation on the problem of evil, but you're adding in the question of God is creating this thing, and why would God do that? Um, my answer to the problem of evil goes back to the God can't thing, and it adds that God didn't even have the capacity to create something from scratch or from absolute nothing. So I think God has ever been creating, or ever creating, I should say. But let me add, since you already know what I think about the problem of evil, that there's another problem called the problem of good. And that's the problem that an atheist oftentimes wrestles with. Why is there so much good in the world? Yes, there's lots of suffering, evil, been going on for a long time. I, totally agree with that. I think it's pointless pain. I don't think God planned it, wanted it, etc. But there's also been a whole lot of cooperation, beauty, goodness. And it's hard for me, well, put it even stronger. It's impossible for me to account for all of that without reference to a God. Or to put milder, the God hypothesis helps to answer the problem of good in a way that I don't know of any atheist that can answer it quite so well.
Bill, go ahead.
Okay, so we said rapid fire, but it's going to take me a minute to frame this. It's just
Yeah,
like
you
Britt.
guys'
It's going to take,
questions are longer than my answers here.
they are. They are. So if I go back 13 point something billion years ago, and science says there was this bang, and again, who knows what the hell happened there, but something happened, and from that moment, the creative energy of the universe expanded out, right? And planets formed, and stars and moons and all kinds of things, and life, at least here, right? And probably, almost assuredly, somewhere else. And that understanding, again, and I think you're familiar with that. I don't think I'm throwing something new at you. That understanding, that creative energy, which we wouldn't have to have as a consciousness, it wouldn't need to be a man in the sky directing affairs. It could just be a natural energy flowing and expanding. That energy could be considered omnipotent. Everything that's ever been done has been done by it. It could be considered all-knowing, because as Eckhart Tolle said, we're the universe expressing ourselves as humans for a little while, and consolidated, we could simply say we are stardust. So it could be all-knowing because everything that is known by it because we are it. It could be considered all-present, omnipresent, because everything everywhere is part of it, so it's everywhere. So when we boil God down to those three ideas, the creative energy of the universe fits that. And knowing what we do know about the history of this planet and the history of the universe, in what way does your framing for God and maybe even religion, how is it any different than me, who I would claim to be like an atheist mystic, where I sense that creative energy, I'm in awe and wonder of the universe, I think we're all connected, but I don't need a conscious being out there to be doing anything. How is there any stronger indication that the way you frame it, let me ask you this, how is your framing different than what I just said? And what would cause me to see a weakness in my position if you are saying something different, that my position couldn't be much more naturally explained and more evident as we look across the universe and try to take in why we have what we have in front of us?
Yeah. Well, one answer I could give you is that if you want to call this force, this power, what was the word you used again? I
Creative
forgot.
energy.
Creative energy. Yeah. If you want to ascribe to creative energy the attributes I would like to describe to God, then I'll just take your term and I'll use that instead of God. Like the terminology doesn't matter to me too much. But one of the elements that for me is really super important, and maybe you can account for this in creative energy, but I have a hard time doing it. And that's the issue of love. I think love is not only generous helpfulness to others, but also receptive relationship. So a kind of giving and receiving. And if your creative energy can both give good things and interact in an intentional way with others, then it sounds like what you're calling creative energy, I'm calling God. Um, I don't know, maybe that's too easy of an answer from what you're suggesting, but I would only add that I think this creative energy that I like to call God has been everlastingly around and um, creating worlds and entities everlastingly. So, um, yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's not a great answer, but that's how that's my first response to your good question.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think of how to ask it, maybe a different facet of it, and try to kind of poke at the edges of this a little more. But
Okay.
um, the fundamental difference seems to me is that to say God, and again, what God means, 1,000 people would say something different, but
Sure.
it seems to intimate something more than the natural process by which the universe created itself,
Mm,
right? And the word God seems to be triggering for folks like me because it pushes me to leave that view that it's just a natural process that the universe created itself.
mm,
And folks like you, I feel like you're right there with me, like you're just a razor's edge away from
yeah.
where I'm at, and yet I can't quite put my finger on what it is exactly that's different. Because I think if you and I are in a room and we're having a conversation long enough, you and I would both just agree, like, hey, Bill, your framing of this creative energy by which the universe created itself fits all the parameters for the most part that I need to hold the view I do.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to sense into what is it that makes your view different than mine, that I should not be an atheist who also believes the universe created itself, and that we ought to love and care for each other and be kind and reduce trauma in the world and help others be kind, right? Like,
Yeah. I got
where does it
no
differ?
Yeah, I got no problem with atheists wanting to be kind and make the world a better place. So more power to you. I wish more Christians were like that. Um, Maybe for me, one of the differences is between probably some language you have heard of, and maybe your listeners have heard of it, the difference between pantheism and panentheism. Pantheism is the idea that everything is divine. There's nothing more than what is the natural order. And if you want to call the natural order God, then that's pantheism. If you don't want to, then you just have naturalism without any theism. But panentheism wants to have a close connection between the natural order and the divine. But the divine is something more than the natural order. It transcends it in some way. The problem with pantheism for me is that if it's true, I have to call Donald Trump God. And I just can't do that because of moral reasons. The problem with naturalism without any God is that I wonder, what is the transcendent moral good that you as an atheist and I as a theist am striving for, that is more than just the process of evolution, the run of the mill of things, whatever. So I guess it comes down to, is there any transcendence in your view of reality? A theist like me can say there is transcendence, but I don't have to go to a kind of supernaturalism that so distinguishes God from creation, that God's sort of out there and entirely different in all ways.
And I think we talked about this earlier, Tom, is that we send articles back and forth to each other,
Yeah.
and you said the other day, I don't mind people who like Bill, like you're close, like you guys are right there, if you were to debate this out. It's what we have to be, what we both want to push back on. In fact, and what this podcast tries to do is like, over here is nihilism and over here is like fundamentalism. Like, I know for sure what God wants in this situation. And
Yeah.
both of those, like, we got to stay away from. So this middle
Yeah.
space of like, we're not really sure, but here's an idea and here's how it fits with evolution, and
Yep.
here's how it fits my understanding of love. Anything in that space, like, I'm okay with. Like, I'm okay
Yeah.
with anything in that space, and I think really you are too.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
here's a question for me. There's going to be a lot of people on this podcast who say love is my highest good and it's not really grounded in a God. Maybe they don't feel like they have to intellectually, or maybe they feel like they're able to get there just from evolutionary kind of arguments. Um, but if this is kind of a Pascal's wager question, but I'm going to do
Okay.
the reverse on it. So
Okay.
Pascal's wager is this idea from 17th century kind of mathematician that said that humans are kind of in a wager about whether God exists or not. And he argued that a rational person should live as if God exists, because if God does not exist, then you may lose a few pleasures. But if God does exist, there's a lot more to gain by that idea. And so he just kind of put his chips on, I think God exists. But I kind of do the opposite nowadays, in the sense that I figure that whatever, even if God was real and a thing, we're likely to be so wrong about it, right? Because we're just historically very bad at this question of ultimate reality. And so my thing with Pascal's wager is, because we're likely to be wrong, and because we're likely to be so biased just as we are as humans, that is there a better way to place love as the highest good without God, given our history of trying to answer the God question because it's just so bad? Um, is there an intellectual humility of just letting the question go and placing love as the highest good without having to ground it in a God, because we're inevitably going to get that part wrong?
Yeah. Well, we're inevitably going to get the good part wrong too. So it's not like we're going to be right about one thing. We're always going to have see through a glass darkly, to use that biblical phrase. So even what the good is something we're trying to grasp at and discern, and we're not sure. So, but that's sort of an epistemological aside.
Because a lot of people claim that just love is my highest value and it kind of acts as God. So if
Yeah.
you do that, are you getting all the benefits of your worldview without having to do any theology?
I think you're getting a lot of the benefits, maybe not all of the
Yeah. So what
benefits.
so what would be missing for that
Yeah,
person that you're saying, hey, if you ground this intuition, you get a little bit more? What would
yeah.
that kind of be?
Well, what if you thought there was a loving spirit who not only called you to live a life of love, but also empowered, inclined, lured, persuaded, wooed um, you toward that? What if you thought there was a companion in the process of this call to love? Um, would that be a more attractive a vision of reality? I think it would, so long as that spirit wasn't a controlling spirit, wasn't going to send people to hell if they didn't love. Um, so I'm going to set aside some of those bad views of God or that spirit and say, what kind? Wouldn't a vision of reality that includes this nudge, this deep nudge toward love, better than a reality in which there was no such thing as a nudge, but that there's somehow just an idea of we ought to do the good thing?
Yeah, so my pushback to that, and then I'll go over to Bill, is a lot of times on this podcast, what we do is we take something that people are doing spiritually, and Bill and I just kind of get of like, what is the root of what's going on here? Like, how do we
Mm,
strip away maybe some of the superstitions or other things that are attached to this spiritual tool? Because something that we're trying to do is really separate the baby from the bathwater, right? Which is
mm,
something that I think all of us are trying to do in this kind of spiritual space. And so when someone says, yeah, so if you take something like tarot cards, we did an episode on occult practices. And the great thing about some of these occult practices is it kind of tunes your brain to notice a pattern. No,
mhm.
if you pull this card, you're tuning your brain to notice this pattern in your day. And Bill and I don't believe that the planets moved in such a way that you picked that card that day. Like that's a little bit too woo woo for both of us, right?
Okay.
But we do see the tool of kind of priming your brain to look for certain patterns that will incur growth because you're noticing things. And so, is it possible to pull? So, for open and relational theology, if we were to imagine that it was a spiritual tool, is there a way to prime your brain for that, always looking for opportunities of love, always looking for that nudge towards love, always, seeking out that pattern and really continually getting your brain to notice these patterns, which then ends up, you know, showing up in your life as these loving opportunities that you notice more, and your relationships deepen and all those good things. Can you do that um, without the belief? Can you strip that from the belief? Can you get the pattern and get the goods from that pattern without the belief? Or do you think you have to
Yeah.
believe it in order to get that tool?
Yeah. Yeah. I, I want to say this really strongly. You don't have to believe that there's a God to live a life of love. So you don't have to, you can follow the tools or whatever mechanisms you have that prompt you to do the right thing, help your neighbor, love your enemy, et cetera, et cetera. I'm making the argument that it might be more attractive to think it's more than just you conditioning your brain. It might be a more attractive vision of reality that there's a companion who's helping you, who's nudging you toward that. So atheists can love, but I'm more attracted to a view that says love and a lover exist, and that lover is a capital L lover. I don't know if that's a good answer to your good question, but
No, I understand. Go ahead, Bill.
I love this, by the way. I love this
oh,
because
thanks.
I think if people really understand you, and I think I do, and people really understand us, and I think at least the folks who follow this regularly do. I think they're going to sense, as I said before, that we're just really so close to each other in,
Yes.
in the space, and we're really fighting over kind of a hair's
Yeah.
thickness.
Yep.
And so the other side of the coin of what Britt just said is that anytime we put our trust into religion, and it's going to be really hard to frame God without a system to put that God on display somehow, right?
Mm.
So if we all just go into our private prayer closets and work out what God is without trusting a canonical text explicitly, without trusting certain voices explicitly, it's going to be really difficult to have any cohesion.
Mm.
So in order to have cohesion, there has to be a community, and the community has to have boundaries. Otherwise, it's not a community at all. And anytime we try to set up a community that claims to know anything about God, it seems to be set up to cause trauma and abuse to people.
Mm.
And so I'm curious if, like, the other side of what Britt just said is that maybe religion, as much as I think if we could create a religion that espouses your framing, I think we'd be fine. I just don't think you can get a group of people together and everybody play that nice and allow that much space for everyone to come to their own internal understanding of what this thing is, and to have some general guidance on being kind to each other without creating boundaries that separate gender or race or ethnicity or sexual identity. And so my question is, if we try to fight to create a religion that is going to be this big tent that loves and welcomes everyone, is that a lost cause? And hence maybe it's better to just throw the baby out with the bathwater, and to start working towards the idea that maybe as I look across the universe, there isn't any way to know that that voice is God, and these are the boundaries that we all ought to maintain explicitly, because that only sets up people to, out of power and greed or some unhealthy attribute, to create a system that in turn still creates tribal lines and boundaries, and again does harm all over again.
Well, I think religion and communities are inevitable. There's no such thing as living a life out of the grasp of that. Now, by religion, I have a very big view of religion. So I think governments can be religions, consumerism can be a religion. I've got a big view of religion, not just a sacred text and whatever, some rituals. To put it another way, you never escape the potential evils that come from organizing with other people. And if you try to live life all alone in solitude, you have just as many, if not more, evils that are possibilities. So I don't think of it, Bill, as we're going to have the right theology and the right people, and this is going to be utopia. I think of it as everybody's always caught up in relationships with others and ideas and institutions and practices and ideologies. Which of those might be better than the alternatives, assuming none of them is perfect?
Doesn't religion, though, create a space where judgment and shame are inevitably going to show up? And
I don't think it's inevitable, but I do agree with you. It's common. Yeah.
it just seems, if we say religion is a better way to go, and again, I maybe you and I would even disagree. Maybe you would agree with me that maybe religion isn't even a necessary part of the formula. That might take another couple hours to work out. But if we're going to espouse God and give people any sort of framing for that, aren't we just setting up a fertile space where unhealthy ideas and lines and boundaries can once again run rampant? It just seems, again, I love your view. I wish all of Christianity would come to where you are, and religion in general. And yet I think if we carry that out, unhealthy voices will once again influence that to just do harm in some other way.
Yeah, well, let's substitute your language for mine. What if we said we're all looking to cooperate with creative love energy? Don't you think that has the potential for negativity as well? People organizing in ways that hurt one another? I think it does. I mean, the ideology that killed the most people in the 20th century was atheistic. It was USSR. I'm not saying that makes it automatically the worst,
I
but
would go back to what you did with the umbrella. I would call that just a religion. It was another
just a
religion.
religion. Okay,
Yeah, I would call
let's do
communism.
that
I
then.
mean, how
Yeah,
it was run, it was a
yeah,
religion.
Another
yeah,
tribal
This was
ideology.
not a country where everybody could, freely
yeah.
share ideas. And so
Okay,
sometimes
well,
that
let's.
argument gets a little bit too much legroom for me.
Okay, well, let's maybe let me see if I can scale back to this issue and see if we're on the same page here. Would you be on the same page as me that life can't be lived well if we try to be solitary individuals?
Yeah.
Say that one more time.
Life can't be lived well if our goal is to be solitary individuals.
No,
That
we
this
need to be in relationship with others.
Okay,
The human species, we're social
yeah,
creatures, and our survival has depended on
yeah.
cohesion and collaboration.
I figured you'd say that. So we're
Yeah.
on the same boat there. So then the only question is, how are we going to do community well? Now, it seems to me that if a community has as its guiding light creative love energy, which I love a lot, but let's just for the moment pretend that that doesn't mean God. Um, don't you think it's quite likely that that community will still have flaws? Will probably still have some shaming that goes on. You guys aren't doing creative love energy right, or whatever. Um, I maybe this is too pessimistic of you for you guys, but I think any community is going to deal with those obstacles. So the answer for me is to try to create the best overall love community. And I'm most attracted to one that has some kind of agent that's loving. So,
Here's I'm going to push back on myself here.
okay.
Because here's where I'm
Uh-oh.
at. If I'm doubting my doubts, this is one of my major things that I doubt about my own kind of approach to how I'm raising my kids. Is there's a really good argument, and you touched on it, that I think you should expound on, because I think it's a really good argument. Like it's
Mm,
an argument that pushes back on myself, and I feel it. And it's the argument that if we are social creatures and we're inevitably going to have systems and religion, and again, I think you define religion like me, it's just how you're orienting yourself in
yeah,
the
really
universe,
broad.
like
Yeah.
really broad, right? And we're going to do that inevitably. Then we should try to make as good a system and as good a God and as good a myth as we can, right?
Hmm.
And when we don't, and when we're kind of in this period of postmodern deconstruction, we've tried to tear down all the systems because there was a lot of harm and all the things. The fear of Nietzsche that I think is really insightful is that he was afraid that if we lose our belief in God, and if God is really dead, which he didn't say triumphantly, like, this is so great. He was
Hmm.
afraid that what would replace it would be worse. And
Hmm.
that's a deep fear that I still hold, is that if you remove God, if you remove the best myth, even Jesus is a little bit holds this space of just someone collectively that we can say this is a myth of a good loving person and we should all try to emulate that. If you lose that, the things that replace it, like politics becoming a religion, which is what happened
Yep.
in the USSR, and consumerism that
Yep.
comes into that space, is far worse than what a good God system could do.
Yeah.
And that's a really, really good argument, that if this is how we are just as humans, maybe the best thing that we can do is collectively imagine the best God that we can possibly imagine, and work together with and towards that thing, even if you don't believe that it's true. Because
Well, yeah.
the myth itself can do a lot more good than, we see young people today, they leave church and then they become, I've told people on this podcast before that if I had to choose for my children to grow up in a religion, any religion, or grow up and politics be their religion, I would choose religion, because
Me too.
politics,
Yeah.
you never have to meet your shadow self. You never even have the opportunity to, because the bad guy is always on the other side, and it's empty and it's it's really soulless. And so there is a really good argument there, I think, that you touched on, but I think is really strong, that if this is just what we do as humans, we collectively get together and we have stories and myths and rituals that bring us together. Why not just do this the best way that we can imagine? And
Yeah.
I think that that's a really good argument. Um, the the
I would.
the
Can
counter
I?
to that. So I hold that, and I have one
Okay.
more thing, and then I want to see what you think. So I hold that, like that
Yeah.
is a strong argument to me. And then the other side of that argument is that the country that did the best as far as individual free rights, let's just say, maybe America isn't the greatest on the happiness scale or healthcare, but individual free rights, we did pretty good as far as countries go. And the reason we did is because Thomas Jefferson, at the very least, he was a deist. I think if he were living today, he would have been an atheist. And he was really looking at the history and the sectarianism going on. And he just really thought, if we're going to do this, if we're going to build a society, we've got to take God out of this and build a separation between, we've just got to take God out of the equation. And so there is an argument that, so I hold those two, that maybe the best we can do is imagine a God worth worshiping, right? A God of love, and move in that direction. Or maybe the reason that we have, whatever good that America has been in the world is because we took God out of it and we tried to build values into a system without God. And so I hold those two ideas, I kind of hold in tension. So I just threw a bunch at you.
Yeah.
Kind of, what do you think about all that?
Two quick comments on
Yeah.
the first one. I try to live as if that God of love exists, but to say I believe in God, that's just, I mean, some people say believe and they mean I'm really certain. For me, I don't use believe in that way. I believe it. I'm living as if. There's good reasons to not believe in God. There's good reasons to be an atheist. I'm living as if there really is a God, and that makes a difference. That's the first point. Second point.
Jordan Peterson does the same thing, which is, I think, why the Jordan
Oh,
Peterson Sam Harris debates were so interesting, because they were almost right in this space where Jordan Peterson says, I choose to act as if God exists, and he cited kind of all the good that it does in his life and how it grounds all his theories. And Sam Harris was very, I think we can get there without God, and that's what made really that debate kind of the talk of our time.
yeah,
Anyway, so that was an interesting way that you phrased that. I've heard that phrasing from him before.
yeah. My second thing is, I think you give Thomas Jefferson too much credit. I mean, if you look at the history of the U.S., 90+% of people believed in God along the way. And even though we tried to separate church and state, we really haven't done a very good job of that. But there is something about Jefferson that I like, and that is, I think, what you were pointing to, and that is there's something about freedom of conscience um, that he had. I think you could incorporate that into a religious view of reality, and I try to do that in my own view. But that isn't always incorporated in religions, and he put his finger on that. That's been helpful in the U.S., I think.
Interesting. Bill, do you have another question?
No, I'm loving the dialogue back and forth, and I'm just trying to. I don't know. I again, I'm going to come back to the same spaces I've already kind of hashed out, which is
Okay.
I do agree with you, by the way, that whenever you try to if any one person tries to draw the perfect line on how much do I love others and how much do I do self-care or make my needs prioritize over another human being's, and we're all trying to balance that, and because we live in a non-binary complex world, there really isn't any way to draw a perfect line. And
No.
so my question, I guess, would be maybe an outflow of that is, if we were to get, again, I know that there's no way for you or I or anyone else to name the perfect system that we all should fall under. But it also seems like we can't have it be a free for all either. And
Right.
and in some ways, I think a liberal perspective of God might be the best we could do. It gives kind of a bare bones framework and we can work within it. But it would seem as though we don't want everyone figuring out their own morality and their own what's good for them and what's good for those around them on their own either, right? Would you say that, or are you really, or would you say you are a fan of letting everybody work out what God is inside of them without any coercion from the sacred text of the world or those who profess to know God's word?
Yeah, I think we always already do that. So there's, yes, some people focus more on text or sages, um, but we're always already trying to make sense of God moment by moment, and we're always already trying to figure out what the right thing, the moral thing is moment by moment. Um, and we're always already influenced by a ton of different things. No one does it in isolation.
How can we get away from, by having sacred texts, whether it's Christianity's or the Bhagavad Gita or any other, how do we create something on the front end that makes it crystal clear to everyone? And also I'll pause here and say, maybe it's not even healthy to take, for instance, children and open them up to how complex the world is. But at
Yeah.
some point, right, when someone moves
Right.
into adulthood and they can handle complex ideas, how do we put, what do we put and how do we put it at the front end so that all of us grow up sensing that these stories should not be intended to be taken 100% literal, and people should
Yeah.
feel safe and have freedom to look at these ideas as maybe even examples of how to do it wrong?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good question. I don't have really great answers except to say we need to hold all sacred texts lightly as human attempts, I think inspired by God, but to me, inspired doesn't mean coerced or directed or somehow controlled. But sacred texts are human attempts to try to make some sense out of divine. And those texts can be closer or further from the truth. So if we help people to hold those sacred texts lightly, hold their spiritual leaders lightly, um, it's different from rejecting all of it and just trying to do things totally on your own, which that doesn't work. Or even worse, just assuming that the text came from God or the leader tells you exactly what God wants. Then I think you're really screwed. At least my experience has been that people who try that end up getting hurt deeply.
I want to address this comment, which is one that I put up here because it's one I'm sure you've gotten before. There's an argument that choosing to believe something is intellectually dishonest, right? And I want you to address that person's comment, which I'm sure you've gotten before, and then also I kind of have a follow-up comment or question that um, that goes something like this: if this like let's just play for with the idea that this God is a myth and doesn't exist, but believing in it really creates a good life,
Mm.
the good life, okay?
Mhm.
Really strong relationships, meaning, purpose, value, deep connection. Let's even say that it does it the best, like it's really good at creating the good life,
Mhm.
but it wasn't ultimate reality, or it wasn't capital T true. Would you want to know, or is the fruit so good and the life so good that you almost wouldn't want to know because you would lose some
Mm.
of the
Mm.
benefits? So would you want to know if it wasn't true?
Yeah.
If there was a cost associated to that knowledge?
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer because it forces me to reject an a priori assumption that I have. Actually, all of those questions, uh, I have an a priori assumption that I can't be certain about such things. So there would never come a time in which I could know for sure that the grand story was correct or incorrect. Like there's no such scenario in which someone walks in and said, "Oh, I've been fooling you all along. This is all a lie," or someone else walks in
Is
and
there
says, "Oh,
That's a good question. Is there any discovery in science that would do that? Like if we could
no,
create consciousness, there's
no,
nothing in science that we could discover or do that would threaten you at all
no.
at
All
this
you
point.
got to do is hang out with scientists for very long to find out how much they disagree with one another." Like
That's true.
there's the best we could get is a scientific consensus on something.
Hmm.
Anyway, so but the question was something about pretending is not the same as believing. Can you rephrase that one again? Like, is it being
Yeah.
dishonest to pretend?
The listener's comment was choose to pretend, which is I think how he's interpreting what you said. I don't think that you
Um,
said those words. And then just
yeah,
kind of the argument that it's then intellectually dishonest to believe something that you really don't know is true or not, and making
yeah,
that leap, because there's some people that just really have a hard time making that leap. And why
yeah,
is it that some people can't make that same leap? In fact, personally, there's been times, especially when I was losing my faith in God, that I tried to make that leap of I'm just going to choose to believe and felt
yeah,
like I couldn't. And so why
yeah,
is it that some people can do that and some people can't? And what would you say to someone who says that it's intellectually dishonest to do so?
yeah. Um, for me, because I don't believe anyone can be certain about these things, I think Descartes' right that we can be certain that we're thinking beings. We probably have certainty over mathematics, but we don't have certainty in relationships. We don't have certainty about facts about the world. We definitely don't have certainty about ultimate reality like God's or whether there is one or not. Um, the best we can do is try to come up with good reasons, but they're always going to be insufficient to give us absolute proof. So let me use an illustration of my own life. I have good reason to believe after 33 years that my wife loves me. Now, there have been times in the past 33 years in which she's done things that are not loving to me because she's not a perfect person. But I have good reasons to believe that overall she's trying to do that. Am I certain of it? No, I can't use certainty in that strict philosophical sense. But gathering together evidences, experiences, etc., I got some pretty good reasons to believe that. When it comes to God, things are a little bit different because I don't think, well, maybe I don't believe that I can look outside and see God walking the dog. Um, on the other hand, I think God is omnipresent, so God's always been present to me. So there's some differences. So there's not going to be a perfect analogy. But what is perfect is I don't think I can be certain there is a God or not. The question for me is, what's the good reasons to think there is a God, and what are the good reasons to think there's not a God? And that for me is always in flux. So I don't think I'm being dishonest when I say, that I don't know for sure that God exists, but I'm still living as if God does, because I'm not sure about much at all.
Yeah. I mean, it's so you would put it in the same umbrella as like I'm choosing to not raise my children in Mormonism. I have some good reasons to think that that was the best choice, but like I don't
Yeah,
know, and I'm moving forward with that belief, really not knowing if that was the best choice.
right.
But anyone has to, I mean, that would be the most broad definition of faith, which
Yeah,
is I don't usually like to use that term because just it's so laden, and it has such baggage. But essentially, we do all have to do that because we have. As soon as you take a step out into the world, you're putting out your own. I'm moving forward in this direction, and I don't know where it's going to go.
no matter
And
what you do,
no matter what you do have to kind of pull yourself up from your bootstraps and make a move at some point.
yep. Who you vote for, you don't know for who you're voting for is the best candidate. Who
Hmm.
you what the next bite of food is going to be healthy or not, you don't know that for sure. You're making faith uh, moves moment by moment in your life. Some of them are faith that are pretty plausible, and you think you got good reasons. Other times you kind of feel like you're shooting in the dark, but it's faith up and down all the time.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. I just don't usually use that. Like I'll find it's like the God word, like faith in God,
Yeah,
especially with the people that I talk to and a lot of the people in this podcast, like it because there's trauma associated with those terms,
yeah,
we end up getting to the same place, but we'll have to use different words because of
yeah,
that trigger and that allergy. But yeah,
yeah.
I'm on board with that. So Bill, do you have I know Tom, you have to head out soon. So Bill, do you have any last comments? Oh, I think we lost his video here for a second. My last thing, and then I'll let you say anything you want to finish up with. And then anyone who's interested in Tom and Tom's work, especially if you're one of these people who still has intuitions that there's a God, or there's intuitions that there's love in the universe. I know that there's people who have that intuition, but you're trying to make sense of it, or you've had some tough experiences, or you've had a faith deconstruction. I really recommend Tom's books. They were a
Thanks, Brett.
really, even though we didn't end up in the exact same place, it was just a really beautiful way to kind of work out some of these um, intuitions and thoughts, and you're wrestling with all of this. And it's just a really great platform for doing that, and a really safe platform for doing that. And I see a lot of people really be changed by that. So I think let's see. Can we talk about process theology just for a second?
Yeah, yeah. Process theology is the idea that God and the world are in process. It shares a lot in common with open and relational thought. In fact, I think of it as a subcategory underneath open and relational thought. But process thinkers have tended to draw more from philosophy and science, and they've tended to make starker claims about the helpfulness of the wide swath of religious traditions, not just Christianity or even theistic ones. Um, and they've also tended, process theologians have tended to have a view of God's power that's pretty much the one I've been mentioning earlier, that there are things God simply can't do. So if open and relational theology is the broad umbrella, and under it, process theology is one option, process theology is probably more on the progressive or liberal end, even of open and relational theology, which is also on the progressive end.
Yeah. And then
Yeah.
I there's a lot of you may or may not know this, our listeners may or may not know this. There's a lot of Mormons who either in Mormonism, like they're still practicing, or out or coming out of Mormonism because it's just so aligned with what they learned about God, will end up in a place like transhumanism.
Mm.
And so transhumanism is kind of this idea, you can get pretty scientific with it, that whatever God is, we can become it. And really, science is going to be the thing that is going to create things like immortality, or, end poverty on earth, and that we can get there together. And that science is going to be really the thing that's driving that. Some people include God in that, some people don't. But how would that relate to kind of that transhumanism idea?
It would embrace those transhumanistic factors that talk about a real role that you and I play in making the world a better place and the future better. It
Hmm.
would embrace the aspects of transhumanism that suggest that things can actually get better. We're not just stuck in a cycle of, the same old, or we're not necessarily going to get worse. So it can share some of those basic assumptions. Um, the idea that we could literally become omnipresent, I'm very skeptical of that. Or literally, as an individual, could be omniscient, know all things. I'm quite skeptical of that. But there are, if becoming divine in the transhumanist sense means that I can become loving like God is loving, open and relational folks would be on board with that.
That makes sense. All right, so I'm gonna let you go so you can prepare for your next appointment. Bill, do you have any last questions or thoughts?
No, I'm just deeply grateful. I come from a system where you're not allowed to really ask the hard questions.
Uh,
And for
uh,
you to sit and allow us to kind of poke at the edges of this and and allow people to kind of see these conversations happen in real time. I just want to say I'm grateful. And again, having seen other podcasts that you've been part of, I listened to two of them where you were with Brian McLaren. I saw one where you were talking about your book, God Can't. And I just am deeply appreciative that you, in this deep, peaceful, calm demeanor, sit with questions where your ideas are being poked at. And I just want to say thank you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to wade into some really complex questions,
Yeah.
the answers
Yeah.
of which I definitely don't know for certain. But
What
thanks for the
I love
conversation.
about this conversation, and then we'll let you go, is that if you were to look on paper, Bill and I have times where we get on our atheist high horse and we'll come down on some kind of, translation or some kind of truth claim, and we can get pretty harsh, Bill and I, because there's a lot to make fun of, or there's
Yes.
there's some easy low-hanging fruit that you can go
Yes.
after, right? And we go after those sometimes. And then when you look at your curriculum, being an elder in the church and NNU, and your pastor work, and you would just seem like we would just be on opposite ends of the spectrum. But really, what I want people to sense from this is that even though there's maybe a hair there in between kind of an atheist mystic or someone who's kind of more of a deconstructed Christian or open and relational theology, or God is relational, there are some differences there, and Tom and I will keep talking about them for the rest of our lives. But it's much different than being in a nihilism versus fundamentalism. That's not where we are. That's not the game that we're playing. It's this space in between of how can we build a good life? How can we instill values in our children? How can we gather in communities that can experience spirituality together? And how do we do that? And those are really big questions. Some of those questions we really don't know what we're capable of as humans, and how we can redo this. Do we try to fix Christianity and make a God more worthy of worship? Do we scrap it and try to build spiritual secular society? Well, that hasn't really been done either. And this is the mess. This is the mess
Yep.
that we're in. But I really feel with Tom that we're kind of still in this mess together, and we're trying to figure out this together. And it's not this nihilism, atheism, high horse, and fundamentalism debate, which you do get that kind of in the broader rhetoric. And so this is why I really love conversations like these, because there's just space in the middle to be able to hold some of these ideas. So I really appreciate
Amen.
your time, Tom, and we will let you go, and appreciate you for joining us today.
It's been an honor and privilege. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Tom. All right, Bill, that was my friend Tom. What do you think?
I'll tell you, he acknowledged it, and it's this battle, because I think we all do it, which is where we hold beliefs. I hold beliefs that are just a little bit away from him, and I'm not going to easily give those up. And he holds beliefs that are just on the other side of that line, and he's not going to easily give it up. And it begs for us to talk about rational thinking and how to be a rational thinker, and what does it mean when evidence on various sides of an issue are presented. How do you get your own pre-existing belief out of the way so that you can hear what the other party is saying or what the other piece of information is, without deeming it dangerous or wrong or bad on the front end, and actually giving it your ear and sitting with it and examining it. And I'd like to be able to say, like, I'm right and he's wrong, and if he would just listen to what I have to say, then he would understand his position's irrational. But I'm very well aware that it might be my position that falls into that too.
Yeah, well, for Tom, I know there's some people I meet, religious people that I meet, that it was like, if you consumed the podcast that I've consumed in the past decade, I don't think you would think that. But with Tom, it's different, because he has thought about, he has read those books, he has done that work. And it's actually a really strong argument. You and I, were reading a book by Brian McLaren, who's very much in this space and does things with Tom of, it seems like we kind of do religion as humans. Let's make the best one that we can. And it's not a bad argument. It's a good argument, especially if on the other side all we have is politics and consumerism filling that hole. That may not be better for people, and that's a good argument.
If the entire world framed religion and God the way he did, it would be a safe planet to live on, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it's one of those things that if everybody was there, the world would be a better place. And so it's like, well, then
And I might go to church. I think you might go to church. If his framing is like that's as close as we get, I might go on Sunday. I could probably live with that.
Yeah, I would still. So my history with Tom is that, I coached his daughter's soccer, and one of his daughters is super philosophical. And I talked to her at soccer practice, and I'm just like, this kid is next level. She ended up going to Harvard, very smart kid. So I had to figure out, like, who's this kid's parents? Like, this kid is talking about philosophy with me. And so my master's program, I studied under him, and I studied open and relational theology because it was the God that was most interesting to work with, like the God that was really not threatened by evolution, like the God that really was not threatened by bad verses in the Bible. Like, that's a God that could stand up to some scrutiny. So I did my master's degree with him and I could have we had hours long conversations with whatever class I was studying under him. And it was super interesting. And the thing, and you'll have to tell me yours, Bill, is like why you can't move that hair over to the other side. And I think for me, the reason that I can't go to the other side was my first argument in this podcast, which is that it doesn't seem like there's any other life in the universe, or at least, from our corner of the universe, it seems quite empty. And then most species have died. And then most of human history is just abject suffering. I mean, you're just dying for the stupidest reasons. It's just a hard, suffering life. And for a time, there was only like a couple thousand humans. Like, we were on the verge of extinction. And so if all of this God trying to invite creatures into higher and higher levels of existence and relationality, to me, even if that was God's plan, that plan seemed to have failed, because for most of life, for most things, it's just suffering. Like, yeah, we get to be in a space where you and I, Bill, can experience a lot of love. But if you were to go back to our ancestry and what it took to get us here, was it worth it? Those are tougher questions. And so Tom pushes back with the idea that, okay, that's the problem of evil, but then what about the problem of good? And I think evolution does more to explain why humans can be good to each other than God explains why things seem to be so bad for most of human history. And that's why I could never jump over. You're muted.
So a couple things. One is, you're right. If somebody said, hey, Bill, you can get into this machine and it's going to randomly drop you at any other time in human history and randomly at some other place.
Yeah, absolutely not.
That's chance in hell I'm taking that wager.
Absolutely not.
Because I'm one of the lucky, privileged people to live in a time and place where, minus health and minus issues I couldn't control, like mental illness and things like that, I am lucky to be in a place where my life is better than probably 99.9999% of the planet of human beings have ever been on this earth have lived. So there's that. So you mentioned earlier that he's well read. I'm very appreciative of that. So when I was preparing for this conversation, I became aware through a couple of these podcast interviews he was on that he's familiar with Rob Bell and Richard Rohr and Eckhart Tolle and all the voices that you and I have some sort of level of trust that they're going to hold these kinds of conversations sacred and recognize the merit of the view that you and I bring to the table. He's read all those folks. So I don't say it lightly, because he's done the hard work. But the reason I can't come to his side is, and it's sort of what you said, which is, and I'm not as philosophical as you are, as you're examining like the problem of evil and problem of good. I've spent a little bit of time there, but not really a lot. Where I've spent my time is listening to all sides and going, what does my brain tell me is the most rational conclusion? And it's not even close for me, that the scale of balance is so lopsided that for me, I can much more rationally, and again, we all judge in our own minds what is rational, what isn't. My brain tells me the most rational explanation is the secular explanation for how we came to this moment. And like you, I recognize that over 200,000 years of human history, and then millions and billions of years before that of whatever we were, but something other than human, that we have our brains and bodies, our perceptions have been rewarded by showing up in the world a certain way as a life form. And that over millions and billions of years, we should expect that to show up as predispositions to want to socialize with other humans, or predispositions to sense awe and wonder when we look up at the stars. And so I don't see any less than natural secular reason for why I should sense, because I do sense awe and I do sense wonder. I don't see any reason why I should attribute that to anything other than the universe creating itself over 13.7 billion years.
Yeah, so my two big reasons why I couldn't fully go where Tom was, even though I was studying under him and reading some of the best material, and there's some science in there that he brings in that's really interesting. And it was that first reason of like, there's just so much extinction and suffering and so much time to get us here where we could even talk about love, that it just seems like a failed project. But then the second argument for me is I could never get over the instinct or the intuition that I'm creating this, I'm doing this, right? And so when you look across human history, we have a God, and then something is not working, whether it's like Martin Luther nailing the treatise on the door because he has some issues with Catholicism, and then Protestantism is born, or Lutheranism is born. Whether it's that, or I mean, in every way, it's like we create gods and we bind together, and then those gods don't really work, or something changes, or we grow morally, and then the God changes, and then the God changes. And when you really look, I should have asked him this question, but when you really look across history, I don't have any intellectual confidence, even though I've studied philosophy and religion, to be able to say, well, every human in history is just kind of making a better God, making a new God. Every community does this over time. But this time, we've got it. This time, we've deconstructed and we're creating the God. And finally, we got our myths right, and this is it. This is the God. This is the God that coincides with science and our intuitions about the world, and we've done it. When you look at the odds of that, just purely mathematically, you cannot. I mean, that's a lottery. Like, maybe he's done it. Maybe he's won the lottery and he's put it together, a system that really brings in science and religion and systems and intuitions about God. Maybe he's done it. It was interesting enough for me to study for 2 years. But I could never just have the confidence to say, out of all the human history, it seems like we're doing this. It seems like we're the ones that are creating this. And I just don't want to play that game. Like, I was just tired of playing that game. And I just had this sense of maybe we're bad at this game, and maybe we need to pull ourselves out and try a new question. The question which you and I tackle on this podcast is, in light of not knowing about God, in light that we're bad at this, how can we build a good life anyway? That just seems to me to be the better question and a better use of my time than trying to figure out the God that's worthy of our worship.
Yeah, you mentioned the game that's being played. I mean, we look at something like the Bhagavad Gita, and we see there are stories of talking deer in there, for instance. And Thomas, I think, certainly would agree that the parts of the Bible that speak to highly unlikely events taking place probably not literally happening. But how do you parse it out? How do you live in a world where you go, well, the talking donkey in the Old Testament is real, but the talking deer in the Bhagavad Gita is not, or Jesus walking on water is real, but somebody,
Yeah.
moving a mountain in this old sacred myth is false, or
Yeah, but Tom is a really interesting argument because that's a really easy place for atheists to win a point in a debate. And I've heard Christopher Hitchens argue this exactly, that when morality moves ahead and like takes a step forward, it'll often be maybe written down in religion, but it's like the society is doing that. Like we decided to read the scriptures about the Bible differently now because our morality has moved, right? And so we read those scriptures differently. But it's not the scriptures that are doing that, it's we're doing that. Like but Tom's argument is interesting because he would call that movement of increasing morality, he would call that God. He would
Yeah.
he would call that God too. And so he would say that just the fact that we're moving forward in morality and that things get better, he brings God into that, which is, and it's more interesting than just the argument that God said this and this is all true. Well, an atheist can just blow that up in 2 seconds. But the idea that we grow together and we become more and more moral because we're a part of God and God is in relation with us, that's a stronger argument than the average one that you get.
So long as people recognize that by that standard, what direction is the world moving and where will it be in 10,000 years or a million years? So for instance, in a million years, if there is intelligent sentient life on planet Earth, it will be something other than human, right? It won't be a human being anymore. Because if we look back a million years, humans weren't then, and now evolution does its process and here we are. And if we fast forward a million years, it's not human anymore. And all the religions that are around today either will be dead or will have 27 followers, right? It will be a heaven's gate, essentially, where there's a very small number of people on the planet who participate in any sort of specific religious ideology that's currently existing on the planet. And so by his own standard, then what happens a million years from now, if that's God doing his process, he's ridding us of the very system that Thomas would like us to consider anyway.
Yeah, I think he'd be okay with that because he would just see these systems as means to an end. So the fact that they collapse and recreate is just always God pulling us into greater and greater relationality and morality. So he would just move God into that. So anyway, super interesting guy, super interesting theology, especially if you're a person on this podcast who has intuitions about God. But it's you feel triggered, you feel trauma, you feel like I'm not sure how to make sense of it. His work is really interesting, especially his book God Can't. And yeah, it's much more fun to engage in this kind of debate where it's not as easy to just throw away your Old Testament God that is just obviously so riddled with problems that it's just not even fun. It's not even fun anymore at that point. It's just too easy. But this conversation is harder because there's a stronger God idea there that has more science in it than your Old Testament God.
Yeah, and another part of this game is that if we're going to say like, hey, I figured it out in 2022, these are the things we discard and these are the things we hang on to, as you're pointing out, 50 years from now, that line will be somewhere else. And as you pointed out, how can we be so arrogant to know that we got any of it right in this moment? Like all of it's maybe.
Yeah. So I think the big difference, if I were to kind of like put an overall statement to this conversation, is that it seems to be that we're so interconnected, and this brings in a lot of the quotes that you do on this podcast with Eckhart Tolle, that it seems like we're so interconnected that we're kind of a collective consciousness. Like Like we are the bees in the beehive that, we talk about bees as if it's like the collective is a kind of animal, right? The collective is much more than just one bee alone. And the collective is a kind of thing, right? And we as humans on this planet interacting with everything else are kind of like that. We're a hive. And because of that, we can move. We can make moves as a collective consciousness. Now, some people will call that God, and include some kind of transcendent reality that allows that to happen. And some people don't. And so it's like we were both on board with this kind of collective hive thing and transcendent reality, and we're moving towards something and all of that. But it's whether or not that's part of God or there's a creator aspect to that, or there's a transcendent reality aspect to that, or whether we are literally just a beehive trying to figure out life, and we make moves together as we really hear each other's stories and communicate is how we do that. And so you and I are more on the fence of, I think this is us. I think we are the collective consciousness, and I think that you can do this without a God, and you can get all the good things without a God. And for Tom, he kind of grounds that into a transcendent reality that's helping to move that process along.
Yeah, beautiful. I love it.
So interesting guy. And then you're out of town next week. So next week I'm going to do a solo dive. I'm going to do some Greek mythology, and I'm going to do some story time, but we will miss you next week. And then we got 2 more episodes talking about Brian McLaren's book, which we got a ton of positive feedback for. And so we'll keep doing those because those are just so great when we get Jenna Spangler and Anthony Miller. And if you enjoyed this conversation, again, these are rare conversations on the internet where it's not the typical binary, like, is there a God, and it because the Bible says so, and really dumb, lame arguments, and atheists just kind of on their high horse, but not thinking about some of the problem of the good. We haven't talked about that on this podcast. So hit the like button, follow us if you enjoyed the conversation, if you enjoy that there's a platform that's having these conversations, which are just much more rare than your usual binary conversation. Please support us so that we can continue to be part of this conversation, and not just allow the really loud voices on the polls to be the only ones communicating about these things. So please support us so that we can continue to do this, and we will see you next time.
All right, folks, have a great day.
This has been another Almost Awakened episode. Check us out at almostawakened.org, where you can check out past episodes, make a donation to keep this podcast running, email us a question or comment, or find out more about the resources shared in today's episode. For coaching opportunities or extra support, visit nononsensespirituality.com to meet with Certified Spiritual Director Brittany Hartley.